Before Egypt became a land of monuments and mythology, it was simply a place where people tried to survive. The Nile River, Africa's longest and most fertile artery, was the lifeblood of these early communities. It flooded predictably, yearly, generously, transforming deserts into green valleys. It gave birth not only to crops, but to culture. The earliest settlers along the Nile arrived during the late Paleolithic and Neolithic periods. Hunter-gatherers who began domesticating animals and cultivating wheat and barley. Over time, they formed permanent villages. These were simple societies, but they were remarkably sophisticated for their age. From as early as 6000 BCE, small agrarian cultures began to thrive in both Upper and Lower Egypt. Known to us today by names like Merimde, Badari, and Fayum, these people left behind pottery, flint tools, and the faintest outlines of organized life. Around 4000 BCE, a transformation began. This era, known as the pre-dynastic period, saw the rapid development of village cultures into regional powers. Two major cultural spheres emerged, Nakada in the south and Madi Buto in the north. They were separated not just by geography, but by climate, belief, and language. In Upper Egypt, where Narmer would eventually rise, cities like Hierakonpolis, Abydos, and Thinis began to expand. These weren't just villages anymore. They had leaders, temples, artisan classes, and warrior elites. Archaeologists have found evidence of planned cemeteries, trade networks, and symbolic art. Meanwhile, in the delta of Lower Egypt, communities were growing in sophistication too. They had access to Mediterranean trade, different crops, and more rainfall. But it was the south that seemed more aggressive, more centralized, more primed for expansion. What held these early communities together? The answer is religion. By 3500 BCE, the Egyptians were already developing a rich spiritual world. They worshipped animals, deified the river, and began to formalize rituals surrounding life and death. Graves became more elaborate. Offerings of food, jewelry, and tools became common. Tombs were oriented toward the west, the land of the dead. People believed that life continued after death, and that one's status in the afterlife reflected their status in this world. This belief in cosmic order, what the Egyptians would call Ma'at, would later become central to the ideology of pharaohs. But its roots were already growing in the pre-dynastic mind. Symbols began to appear: the falcon, the lotus, the papyrus, the scepter. These icons would become the vocabulary of Egyptian civilization. They were more than decoration. They were identity. As these city-states grew, so did competition. Land, water, and trade routes became the prizes of war. Archaeological evidence shows that settlements were burned, mass graves were dug, and warriors were buried with weapons in hand. One of the most significant forces of this era was the Nakada culture, which began expanding aggressively. Nakada 2 and 3 phases saw rapid political centralization in the south. Larger tombs, wealthier elites, and more standardized art and architecture emerged. By the time Narmer was born, around 3200 BCE, much of Upper Egypt had already been consolidated under a few powerful rulers. Cities like Thinis and Hierakonpolis were rising regional superpowers. Egypt was not yet one nation, but it was moving inexorably in that direction. The Nile divided Egypt into two parts, but it also connected them. The ancient Egyptians knew this and gave their land two names: Ta Shemau, the land of the south, Upper Egypt, and Ta Mehu, the land of the north, Lower Egypt. The two regions had different gods. In the north, Cobra goddess Wadjet was the protector. In the south, falcon god Horus reigned supreme. Different crowns were worn by different kings, the white Hedjit crown of the south and the red Deshret of the north. This division was not just symbolic. It shaped everything, from art to burial practices to temple construction. But it also laid the groundwork for one of the greatest moments in world history: unification. And all signs suggest that the south was preparing for conquest. The kings of Thinis and Hierakonpolis were becoming more ambitious. Their tombs grew in size, their armies were more organized, and their names, like Scorpion and Ka, were remembered by future dynasties. Narmer did not rise in a vacuum. He was the product of centuries of cultural evolution, warfare, trade, and religious development. The southern kings had learned how to rule, how to command loyalty, and how to wage war. The northern cities, though rich, were politically fragmented, more vulnerable to invasion. By the end of the 33rd century BCE, one leader would take advantage of this imbalance. He would claim not just a throne, but a destiny. Narmer, first of the Pharaohs, unifier of the two lands. His reign would mark the end of prehistory and the beginning of one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. But before his triumph, we must first understand his origins and how a boy from Thinis would go on to change the world. In the arid heart of Upper Egypt, nestled between the sacred city of Abydos and the powerful religious center of Hierakonpolis, stood Thinis, a city of warriors, priests, and kings. By the time of Narmer's birth, Thinis had become the dominant power in Upper Egypt, rivaled only by Hierakonpolis in wealth and Abydos in religious prestige. Thinis was more than a city. It was a dynasty. Its kings had expanded their influence by conquest and diplomacy, slowly absorbing smaller communities along the Nile. These early rulers are known to us today by mysterious names preserved on pottery and ivory: Irihor, Ka, and the enigmatic King Scorpion. Narmer was likely born into this powerful lineage. He may have been the son of King Ka, inheriting not only the throne but also a vision, a belief that the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt was his divine mission. Though the details of his childhood are lost to time, we can imagine the world Narmer grew up in. The royal court of Thinis would have been a center of ritual, warfare, and politics. From an early age, Narmer would have been trained in the arts of leadership, rhetoric, military command, and religious ceremony. He would have watched scribes etch the earliest forms of hieroglyphs into ivory tags. He would have been schooled in the lore of gods, Horus, Seth, Osiris, and taught to see himself not merely as a mortal prince, but as a vessel of divine order. As a youth, he likely accompanied his father on military expeditions and diplomatic journeys. He saw the fragmented state of Lower Egypt with his own eyes, and in that fractured delta, he saw opportunity. To understand Narmer's rise, we must understand the tools of power in pre-dynastic Egypt. Rulers didn't only wield weapons, they wielded symbols: the crook and flail, the bull tail worn on their kilts, and the crowns they wore spoke to divine legitimacy and earthly rule. Narmer mastered this visual language. From his earliest appearances on ceremonial objects, he is depicted with the strength of a lion and the grace of a god. His name itself, Narmer, combining symbols of a catfish and chisel, implies strength, patience, and craftsmanship. It was more than a name, it was a brand. And in a world still forming its mythology, such symbolism carried enormous weight. While Narmer's family ruled Thinis, other powerful cities vied for dominance. Chief among them was Hierakonpolis, a city sacred to Horus and home to some of the most remarkable early temples and artworks. For decades, Kings of Thinis and Hierakonpolis may have been locked in uneasy alliances, occasionally broken by war. But by Narmer's time, a great unification had occurred. Upper Egypt had become one. Whether by conquest or coalition, Narmer had either subdued or absorbed these rival powers. He emerged not just as a prince, but as king of Upper Egypt, wearing the tall white crown and commanding the loyalty of a united southern realm. Now his gaze turned north. The delta of Lower Egypt was a land of riches, fertile fields, thriving ports, and ancient cities like Buto and Sais, but it was politically fragmented. Independent chieftains ruled over marshy provinces, often feuding with one another. Narmer saw a fractured enemy. He would not just conquer the north, he would absorb its identity, symbols, and spirit into his own reign. Preparation for such a campaign required immense resources. Narmer expanded his army, perhaps calling upon warriors from the south and Nubian mercenaries. He gathered supplies, built boats for river transport, and likely consulted his priests and oracles. He also began to craft a narrative, a divine justification for war. He was not just a king marching north. He was Horus, bringing Ma'at, order, to a land gripped by Isfet, chaos. The final years before Narmer's unification campaign must have been tense. Trade with the north continued. Spies likely moved between the courts. Treaties may have been proposed and broken. Narmer may have sent envoys bearing gifts or threats. Yet, unlike his predecessors, Narmer did not raid and retreat. He would conquer and rule. He would reshape Egypt not just through battle, but through belief. As he stood on the brink of history, Narmer was more than a king. He was a bridge between ages, between the tribal warfare of the past and the divine monarchy of the future. The Nile flowed steadily northward, and soon so would his armies. The next part of our journey will take us into the crucible of war, into blood, into conquest, into the forging of a nation. Narmer's destiny was not only to rise, but to unify. As the 32nd century BCE dawned, Lower Egypt was a land of wealth and rivalry. The fertile Nile delta stretched out like an open fan into the Mediterranean Sea. Unlike the arid cliffs of the south, the delta teemed with life. Papyrus marshes, fish-filled canals, and bustling settlements. But it was divided. Dozens of regional chiefs ruled separate city-states. Buto, Sais, Mendes, Shoas. Each had its own patron deity, customs, and armed forces. Alliances were fickle. Wars broke out regularly. Though culturally advanced, Lower Egypt lacked the centralized authority that Narmer's Upper Egypt had painstakingly developed. For Narmer, this was both danger and opportunity. Narmer did not strike at Lower Egypt blindly. His campaign was carefully planned, politically, religiously, and militarily. It is likely he spent years preparing, studying his enemies, fortifying supply routes, and consolidating absolute loyalty among his southern governors. He also needed to frame this conquest not merely as ambition, but as divine mandate. According to his priesthood, Narmer was the earthly avatar of Horus, the falcon god of kingship. Lower Egypt, associated with the god Seth, symbolized chaos and rebellion. The struggle between Narmer and the delta was myth made real. Every battle, every town captured, every enemy slain would be part of a sacred drama. Narmer's army was not like modern legions. It was a coalition of warriors from Upper Egypt and possibly Nubia. Armed with maces, spears, flint knives, bows, and shields, they marched northward in waves along the river and overland routes. The earliest battles likely targeted border towns and outposts. Skirmishes at key locations helped Narmer test the strength and tactics of the northern forces. These early victories were not only military triumphs, they were psychological blows to the Delta's fragile alliances. As Narmer's banners advanced, his legend grew. His enemies feared him. His allies praised him. His enemies began to call him more than a king. They called him a storm. It is during this campaign that the most iconic artifact of early Egypt was likely created, the Narmer Palette. Discovered at Hierakonpolis, this ceremonial stone was never meant for battle. It was for the temple, a ritual object of enormous political weight. One side shows Narmer in the white crown of Upper Egypt, striking down a captive as Horus looks on approvingly. Below, fallen enemies lie in heaps. On the reverse, Narmer wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, surveying a procession of headless foes. Two mythical beasts, their long necks intertwined, represent the unity of the two lands. This was more than art. It was a manifesto. It proclaimed Narmer not only as a conqueror, but as a bringer of divine order. With this palette, he announced his rule to the gods themselves. The final phase of Narmer's war likely culminated at Buto, one of the most sacred cities in Lower Egypt, and home to the cobra goddess Wadjet. Here, the Northern Coalition made its last stand. We do not have detailed records of the battle, but the aftermath speaks volumes. Monuments in the north begin to bear Narmer's name. The iconography shifts. The red crown appears beside the white. Ritual artifacts suddenly use unified symbolism. Narmer had won. The war was over. Buto had fallen, and with it, the independence of Lower Egypt. The Delta was no longer a collection of kingdoms. It was part of a greater whole. Narmer did not simply conquer the north. He transformed it. He appointed new governors, likely from his loyal southern elite. He began to standardize laws, weights, measures, and religious practices across both regions. Crucially, he did not erase Lower Egypt's identity. Instead, he integrated it. He married its gods, its symbols, and even its crown into his own image. This was not annihilation, it was synthesis. From this fusion of Upper and Lower Egypt would emerge a single culture, a single administration, and a single divine monarchy. The conquest was done. But Narmer's greatest challenge still lay ahead. How do you keep a kingdom unified after the war is won? With the conquest of Lower Egypt complete, Narmer emerged not just as a warlord, but as a nation-maker. To signify his rule over both Upper and Lower Egypt, he adopted a new symbol of power, the pshent, or double crown. It fused the tall white hedjet crown of Upper Egypt with the coiled red deshret of the north. This was more than royal attire. It was a living emblem of unification. Wherever Narmer went, the crown spoke. I am the king of the two lands. With it, Narmer began to reframe his identity. He was no longer just a southern monarch. He was the Pharaoh, a title that would echo through 3,000 years of history. A ruler needs a seat of power, and Narmer likely founded or expanded a new capital city at the geographic and symbolic center of his kingdom, Memphis. Located just south of the Delta, Memphis was where Upper met Lower Egypt, a neutral ground and strategic point of administration. In Memphis, Narmer could oversee trade from the Mediterranean, communicate with governors across Egypt, and build temples that honored the gods of both regions. It wasn't just a city, it was a message. It said, "This is where Egypt is reborn." Unification wasn't just ceremonial, it required a functioning bureaucracy. Narmer had to manage a kingdom stretching nearly 1,000 kilometers. He appointed regional officials, likely called nomarchs, to govern Egypt's districts, nomes, on his behalf. To oversee this vast administration, Narmer expanded the use of writing. Hieroglyphs, once used for religious labeling, became tools of governance. Tax records, trade accounts, and royal decrees began appearing on ivory tags, jars, and stone tablets. The scribe class was born, and with it, the first Egyptian civil servants. Narmer was not just a politician, he was a priest-king. In Egyptian thought, the pharaoh was not merely chosen by the gods, he was a god. He embodied Horus, the sky falcon who ruled the living. By aligning himself with Horus, Narmer declared himself the agent of Ma'at, cosmic balance and justice. His word was law, not only by political authority, but by divine order. To rebel against Narmer was to rebel against the gods themselves. Temples became royal institutions. Priests became royal advisors. Festivals honored Narmer's dual identity as ruler and divine protector. Narmer was not just a politician, he was a priest-king. In Egyptian thought, the pharaoh was not merely chosen by the gods, he was a god. He embodied Horus, the sky falcon who ruled the living. By aligning himself with Horus, Narmer declared himself the agent of Ma'at, cosmic balance and justice. His word was law, not only by political authority, but by divine order. To rebel against Narmer was to rebel against the gods themselves. Temples became royal institutions. Priests became royal advisors. Festivals honored Narmer's dual identity as ruler and divine protector. With peace came prosperity. Narmer restructured Egypt's economy to take advantage of its vast agricultural wealth. He implemented systems for collecting grain taxes, storing surplus, and redistributing food in times of famine. The king likely initiated large-scale irrigation projects to stabilize food production and support growing cities like Memphis. Trade routes were secured with neighboring Nubia and Canaan. Narmer's Egypt exported papyrus, linen, and grain, while importing gold, incense, timber, and copper. The state was no longer just a battlefield, it was a machine. By the end of his reign, Narmer had achieved what no one before him had even dared to imagine. He had turned rival kingdoms into one. He had created a capital, built an administration, unified gods, and invented a new role for the king, Pharaoh. His reforms laid the foundations for a system that would endure for millennia. Egyptian kings would wear the double crown in his image. The two lands would remain one nation. Even the afterlife was shaped by the order he imposed. Narmer had not only conquered Egypt, he had invented it. In the sands of Hierakonpolis, buried beneath a temple dedicated to the falcon god Horus, archaeologists unearthed one of the most iconic objects in all of ancient Egyptian history, the Narmer Palette. It is not gold. It is not encrusted with jewels. It is a slab of siltstone, no taller than 2 feet. But its meaning is immeasurable. In its carved surface lies the story of a kingdom born. It is the first visual declaration of statehood, a statement of conquest, divinity, and unbreakable rule. And though it speaks with symbols, it resounds louder than any inscription. The front side of the palette is where the legend begins. Narmer, towering in size, wears the tall white hedget crown of Upper Egypt. In one hand, he grips the hair of a kneeling enemy. In the other, he raises a mace, ready to strike. To his left stands Horus, the falcon god, perched atop a papyrus plant, holding a leash that tethers a human head. The message is clear. The gods sanction Narmer's dominance. Beneath his feet, another man lies either dead or groveling, symbols of submission, death, or both. Behind Narmer, his sandal-bearer follows, a reminder that this is a ritual act, a sacred execution. This is not a battlefield scene. It is ceremony. It is Mayat, order imposed upon Isfet, chaos. Flip the palette, and we see Narmer again, this time wearing the red Deshret crown of Lower Egypt. He walks in procession, inspecting the decapitated bodies of his foes. Each head is placed neatly between a pair of legs. There are 10 bodies, but more heads. Brutality made orderly. Ahead of him, 4 standard-bearers march, followed by mysterious figures, possibly gods or priests. This is a funeral for rebellion, a parade of vengeance. At the bottom of the palette, 2 bulls' heads represent strength and kingship. Between them, a mighty bull breaks into a walled city, possibly a symbolic reference to Narmer's conquest of Lower Egypt. At the heart of the palette lies a circular depression, once used to grind cosmetics for ritual use. Surrounding it are 2 fantastic beasts, serpopards, long-necked creatures with bodies like leopards and serpentine necks. Their heads twist together, their necks entwined by ropes held by handlers. This is the moment of fusion. Upper and Lower Egypt, 2 beasts once wild, now bound together. Not destroyed, but controlled. Harmony through domination. The serpopards do not exist in Egyptian mythology outside this context. Their presence may reflect influence from Mesopotamia, or perhaps Narmer's unique use of foreign symbolism to communicate a singular message. Opposites united under one king. The Narmer Palette is not a documentary. It is propaganda, an ancient press release carved in stone. It distills an entire military campaign into a single sacred ritual. No armies are shown, no strategy depicted. Only the outcome, order sanctioned by the gods, enforced by the king. It uses a visual language that predates formal hieroglyphs, but establishes a grammar of kingship that would be used for thousands of years. Every pharaoh after Narmer would adopt the same poses, the same crown, the same falcon-headed approval. And every time they did, they called back to this moment, the origin. The Narmer Palette gave Egypt something it had never had before, state ideology in image form. It became a template for royal propaganda, echoed endlessly on temple walls, stelae, tombs, and obelisks. It introduced conventions that would become standard. The pharaoh depicted larger than anyone else. The smiting pose, always with mace raised. The king as divine executor of justice. Victory framed not as conquest, but as cosmic balance. And it declared the new role of the pharaoh. Not merely a man, not merely a king, but a god on earth, chosen to maintain order across the 2 lands. The Narmer Palette is not just a relic, it is the blueprint for pharaonic power. After unifying the 2 lands, Narmer ruled over a kingdom more vast, complex, and diverse than any leader in Egyptian memory. Egypt was no longer a land of warring cities. It was a single entity, bound not only by geography, but now by ideology. But the work of unification was far from complete. Victory on the battlefield meant little if the people could not live under the same law, the same symbols, the same calendar, the same gods. This was the true test of kingship, to maintain Mayat, the balance of the universe. And only a divine ruler could do it. Narmer's new government was a monumental undertaking. At its heart was the royal court, possibly stationed in Memphis or the sacred city of Thinis. Here, viziers, high priests, and royal scribes served under the pharaoh's absolute command. The king's word was binding law. His presence, rare and awe-inspiring, was enough to silence rebellion and inspire loyalty. To govern Egypt efficiently, Narmer likely divided the land into administrative districts, each governed by trusted allies, often family or generals. These officials, later known as nomarchs, ensured the collection of grain, tribute, and labor. The king became the heart, the officials, the arteries of the kingdom. Religion was not separate from the state, it was the state. Narmer knew that to maintain unity, he had to appear not just as ruler, but as divine intermediary. Temples rose across the land, especially in cities like Hierakonpolis, Abydos, and newly established centers. These were more than places of worship. They were economic hubs, storing grain, hosting festivals, and managing local wealth. In these temples, statues of Narmer stood beside gods. His name was inscribed on votive offerings, and festivals celebrated his victories as sacred events. It is likely that he traveled through the kingdom, performing ritual appearances, reinforcing his divine presence and reminding the people, the king is order. During Narmer's reign, hieroglyphic writing blossomed from sacred symbolism into a tool of the state. Ivory tags, cylinder seals, pottery fragments, and ceremonial artifacts now bore official inscriptions. These recorded shipments of goods, the names of regions, offerings to temples, and titles of officials. This new writing was not for public literacy. It was the tool of the elite, the scribes who documented Egypt's wealth and divine order. Narmer's court likely employed dozens, if not hundreds, of trained scribes to maintain the machinery of the state. In doing so, Narmer established one of history's first bureaucratic systems. Stability led to prosperity. Egypt's agricultural economy boomed under Narmer's administrative reforms. Annual harvests, made predictable by the Nile's flood cycle, were carefully tracked and taxed. But Narmer also looked outward. Trade routes were opened or expanded, south to Nubia, where gold, cattle, and exotic goods were exchanged. East to the Red Sea, where incense and minerals came in. Northeast into Canaan, where wood, wine, and copper could be sourced. Evidence of foreign contact appears in pottery, luxury goods, and ceremonial knives, suggesting that Narmer's Egypt was not isolated, but already international. He ruled the Nile, but he touched the wider world. In his later years, Narmer's focus may have shifted from conquest to continuity. Egypt was no longer an experiment, it was a civilization. He likely began grooming his successor, possibly Horaha, a prince or relative, ensuring the bloodline would remain strong and the throne secure. He may have overseen the first plans for royal mortuary cults, laying the groundwork for Pharaonic funerary traditions that would stretch across dynasties. Tombs grew larger, grave goods more elaborate, rituals more standardized. Narmer's reign ended not in flame, but in structure. He had conquered chaos, and in its place he left order, temples, cities, laws, beliefs, and symbols that would persist for thousands of years. But how would his successors remember him? How would his story evolve into myth? Before Narmer's name was etched into stone and history, a long line of forgotten kings laid the groundwork for his reign. Archaeologists call them the rulers of Dynasty Zero, a modern term used to describe the semi-mythical kings who ruled during the late pre-dynastic period. Men like Irihor, Ka, and the mysterious Scorpion King, yes, real, not just legend, were not emperors in the traditional sense, but powerful warlords of cities like Thinis and Hierakonpolis. Their names are known to us from scratched inscriptions on pottery shards and tags. They expanded territory, developed religious customs, and introduced early hieroglyphic writing. Narmer was their heir, and their revolution made his possible. While earlier kings ruled parts of Egypt, Narmer was the first to rule all of it. His unification of Upper and Lower Egypt marked a profound turning point, not only politically, but spiritually. He wasn't merely a regional strongman. He was the first true pharaoh, meaning a god-king who embodied divine authority over a unified land. He wore the double crown, used state symbols that represented the two lands, and claimed universal sovereignty under the blessing of Horus. This transition, from many rulers to one, ushered in Dynasty 1, the beginning of over 30 dynasties that would span 3,000 years of history. And at the very start of that list is one name: Narmer. Narmer's tomb is located in the sacred city of Abydos, in the royal necropolis of el-Ka'ab. This was no coincidence. Abydos was the center of the cult of Osiris, the god of the afterlife. To be buried there was to walk directly into the realm of the gods. His tomb, though modest by later standards, was monumental for its time, constructed with mud brick and wood, and filled with offerings. Nearby are the tombs of earlier kings and his immediate successors, creating a sacred lineage in death as in life. It's possible Narmer was deified after death, as later pharaohs honored him not just as a predecessor, but as the father of kingship. Narmer was succeeded by a king named Hora-Ha, likely his son or close relative. Hora-Ha continued Narmer's policies of unification, administration, and religious expansion. Some scholars even suggest Hora-Ha was the same person as Menes, the semi-mythical unifier referenced by later historians. Whoever he was, Hora-Ha built on Narmer's foundations. He further developed Memphis, consolidated central authority, and may have led military campaigns into Nubia or the Sinai. The state Narmer forged did not collapse. It matured. As generations passed, Narmer's historical reality began to blend with myth. Later Egyptian king lists, like those carved on the Abydos king list, the Turin Canon, and the writings of Manetho, refer to the first king as Menes. Was Narmer Menes? Was Menes a title? A fusion of Narmer and Hora-Ha? We may never know for sure. But what matters is that Narmer became legend. He was remembered as the king who tamed the Nile, who brought balance to a divided land, who laid the first stone in the foundation of civilization. In temples, he was evoked as a symbol of legitimacy. In tombs, he was honored as the first of the great ones. His icon, the smiting pharaoh, would be copied for millennia. With Narmer's reign and the establishment of Dynasty 1, Egypt entered a new phase of human history: dynastic monarchy. A single lineage ruling in perpetuity, backed by religion, law, writing, and monumental architecture. Pharaohs would rise and fall, but they would all trace their legitimacy back to Narmer. He became the model of kingship, the origin story every dynasty claimed to inherit. Temples, tombs, and texts across Egypt would honor him. Even during periods of civil war, foreign rule, or upheaval, Egyptians would look back to Narmer's unification as the golden beginning. His power was not just in life, it was in legacy. Narmer's reign marked the unification of Egypt, but the effects of that unification would unfold over generations. The core ideas Narmer set in motion, centralized authority, divine kingship, ritual governance, and symbolic rule, became the foundation for Egypt's rise from a fragmented territory to a continental superpower. From Dynasty 1 through Dynasty 3, Egypt did not just survive, it flourished, and the process began immediately after Narmer's death. Under Hora-Ha, Jet, Den, and their successors, the early pharaohs turned Narmer's prototype into a dynastic system. They developed the royal court further, expanded the use of scribes, and created an elite class of nobles, generals, and priests who were bound to the pharaoh by oaths and economics. Royal tombs in Abydos became larger and more elaborate, with subsidiary burials of servants and guards. a practice that signaled extreme central authority. The pharaoh was no longer just a ruler. He was the state, the living god. One of the most visible signs of a growing centralized power was the move toward monumental architecture. The royal tombs of early dynasties, especially in Abydos and Saqqara, show increasing size, complexity, and sophistication. By Dynasty II, kings began using stone, not just mud brick. They laid the conceptual groundwork for temples and tombs that would awe generations. These were not only tombs, they were statements of eternity, and they were a prelude to something far greater. Around 2670 BCE, several centuries after Narmer, Pharaoh Djoser ascended the throne. His reign marked the start of Dynasty III, and with it, the Old Kingdom. Djoser commissioned his architect, Imhotep, to build him a tomb unlike any before. What they created at Saqqara would become legendary: the Step Pyramid, the first pyramid in history. It was a new expression of what Narmer had begun: kingship as eternity, in stone. This structure, with its stacked terraces towering 60 meters into the sky, signaled that the Egyptian state had not only survived Narmer's revolution, it had ascended. From Narmer to Djoser, Egyptian rulers expanded their control of land, labor, and resources. Irrigation systems became more organized. Canals regulated the Nile's annual flood, and granaries stored surplus to prevent famine. Labor was no longer just communal, it was state-directed. Thousands of workers could now be mobilized to build roads, temples, and tombs. In exchange, they were fed, housed, and protected. This central control wasn't simply tyranny, it was stability, and it enabled Egypt to grow economically, culturally, and spiritually. The system that began with Narmer reached its architectural zenith in Dynasty IV under kings like Sneferu, Khufu, and Khafre. These rulers, heirs to Narmer's vision, commissioned the Great Pyramids of Giza, the most iconic symbols of Egypt's grandeur. These pyramids were not spontaneous marvels. They were the result of centuries of political organization, religious development, and engineering experimentation, beginning with Narmer. From the unification of two lands came the will to last forever, and the pyramids were just that: timeless monuments to divine kingship, born from the dream Narmer had centuries before. The journey from mace-wielding unifier to eternal god-king had reached its peak. But the memory of Narmer didn't end with stone. It continued in rituals, in royal names, in every crown placed upon every pharaoh's head. Narmer's death marked the conclusion of one life, but the birth of something far greater. A civilization rooted in the order he had imposed, the ideas he had shaped, and the myths he had inspired. The specifics of his passing are lost to time. No chronicler recorded the final days of Egypt's first pharaoh, but his memory was not buried with him. Through stone, symbol, and statecraft, Narmer became more than history. He became timeless. His tomb, located at el-Ka'ab in Abydos, remains a landmark of early Egyptian kingship. Though modest compared to later pharaohs, it marked the beginning of a royal necropolis where generations of rulers would seek their eternal rest. Here, Narmer joined the realm of Osiris, the god of death and rebirth. Abydos, the city of the dead, became a sacred pilgrimage site for millennia. Even in death, Narmer ruled, his name invoked in funerary rites, his memory etched into the very bedrock of the nation's religious identity. In later king lists and priestly records, the name Menes emerges as Egypt's first king. Historians now believe Menes may have been Narmer, Hora-Ha, or even a symbolic fusion of both. To later Egyptians, it didn't matter which man did what. They remembered the moment more than the man, the act of unification, the creation of Egypt. Menes became the myth. Narmer was the reality. Together, they embodied a new origin story, one of divine kingship, eternal unity, and sacred order. This blending of fact and legend didn't dilute Narmer's legacy. It magnified it. On temples and tombs across the Nile, a single image repeated endlessly over thousands of years. The pharaoh holding a mace aloft, grasping a foe by the hair. This is Narmer's pose, the smiting king. It first appeared on the Narmer Palette, and it became an enduring symbol of Pharaonic authority. Every king from the Old Kingdom to the Ptolemies, native or foreign, used this visual language. The smiting pose didn't just say, "I am king." It said, "I am Narmer. I bring order. I restore balance. I uphold Ma'at." Throughout Egypt's long history, Narmer was honored in temple inscriptions, especially in Abydos and Hierakonpolis, offering rituals where priests recited the names of the ancestors, coronation ceremonies, where new pharaohs invoked the unity of the two lands. A tradition Narmer began. Even during times of turmoil, civil wars, invasions, dynastic collapse, Narmer remained a symbol of stability. His name was a compass when the nation lost its way. He became the fixed point in Egypt's cultural memory, the first, the unifier, the divine. In the modern era, Narmer was rediscovered not through myths, but through archaeology. The Narmer Palette, found in the temple ruins of Hierakonpolis, became the Rosetta Stone of early Egyptian statehood. Scholars and historians, stunned by the clarity of its message, realized they were looking at the dawn of civilization. Today, Narmer's image can be seen in museums across the world. His story is taught in schools, studied in universities, and filmed in documentaries. He is not forgotten. He is not buried. He stands at the gates of history, welcoming us into the ancient world. Narmer ruled before pyramids, before papyrus scrolls, before most written words. Yet, his legacy is greater than many kings who came after. He was a warrior, yes, but also a visionary, a maker of nations, a priest of order, a builder of systems that endured the test of time. He is the reason Egypt rose. He is the reason Egypt stayed. And in every crown worn by every pharaoh who followed, Narmer still reigns. This is his legacy. This is Narmer, the first pharaoh who united Egypt.